Among the Ibos of Nigeria by George Thomas Basden. Chapter 1. From Liverpool to Onitsha. Probably there is no part of the world which has been more anathematized than the west coast of Africa, and yet it has never ceased to cast its spell over men and to attract them to its surf-washed shores. Perhaps also no other country has been shrouded in so much mystery or held in thrall by such powers of darkness. More particularly, the Niger has dominated the minds of men with a fascination well nigh incomprehensible, except to those who have felt its influence. From the days of Pliny downwards, no river has given rise to so many and varied speculations as to its course and ultimate discharge. Not until 1830 was the problem solved, when the brothers Lander passed down the river and, after many adventures, found themselves gazing after the sea at Brass. For 35 years, intrepid explorers had been baffled in the task of tracing the course of the great river. Mungo Park and many of his successors in the quest had indeed fallen in the fight. The discovery of the embouchure of the Niger by the Landers settled forever all speculative theories as to its course, and cleared up a mystery which had been for years a subject of discussion amongst interested enthusiasts. Their success, however, had come late. The toll of lives already exacted and the disastrous endings of previous expeditions had bred such hopeless despair that few were the seers whose vision could penetrate the dark clouds and foresee the possibilities of the Niger. Government was not inclined to move any further in this matter of exploration, and probably those who advocated the decision felt that their action had been justified when the disasters of the ill-fated expedition of 1832 to 1834 became known. Lander dead, together with 38 others of the 48 who had set sail from Liverpool. Misfortune and death had pressed heavily upon them, yet those brave hearts who went forth chiefly at the instigation of MacGregor Laird laid the foundation of that prosperity which eventually, in the providence of God, resulted in Nigeria being added to the British Empire. The expedition of 1841 was practically due to the persistent efforts of Sir Thomas Fowell Buxton, whose name will ever be held in honoured remembrance in West Africa. Equipped with every necessary that thought could suggest and money supply, the expedition started on the great adventure, cheered by the good wishes of all, from Prince Albert, who had presided at the inauguration meeting at Exeter Hall, June 1, 1840, downwards. No expedition had ever gone forth under brighter auspices or with greater éclat. But, alas, all too quickly enthusiasm changed to despair. The narrative of that ill-fated voyage up the Niger depicts an almost unparalleled series of disasters. Its failure killed Fowell Buxton and caused such profound depression that for years all further effort to open up the river was abandoned. 13 years later, the indefatigable MacGregor Laird, with dauntless energy and perseverance, succeeded in dispatching the Pleiad under the command of Dr. Bakey. This venture was unique and inaugurated a new era of Niger exploration, inasmuch as Dr. Bakey and his companions navigated hundreds of miles of the Niger, and they traced the course of the river Benue to within a short distance of Yola, and, most wonderful to relate, returned without the loss of a single life. This unprecedented success stirred up Laird to yet greater exertions, and after many struggles and rebuffs, he succeeded in launching the expedition of 1857. The two ships engaged, the Dayspring and the George, arrived at Abo on the Niger on July 20th of that year, and 5 days later they reached Onitsha. The latter place was destined to become an important centre for the development of the country. The expedition laid the foundation of commercial and missionary enterprise amongst the Igbo people, and in the following pages an attempt is made to set forth some of the main facts concerning their lives and customs. It was characteristic of the times and of the English that so much had been left to the persevering exertions of a private individual. In the enthusiastic days just prior to the departure of the expedition of 1841, the Committee of the Church Missionary Society had expressed the hope that the Niger would be a highway for the gospel. But the honour of making such a prospect possible falls to MacGregor Laird. It was the humblest of beginnings, alike from a mercantile and a missionary point of view, and yet of such importance that within 6 years, Burton writes, "We shall never drop the Niger. The main artery of Western Africa, north of the line, must not be neglected." Only those acquainted with the history of Nigeria since those adventurous days can adequately comprehend the marvellous strides taken in the opening up of the country. Writing with reference to the trading affairs of the Niger, Lieutenant Colonel Mockler Ferryman says, "As an instance of the rapid development of a new land, there is, perhaps, nothing more interesting in the commercial history of England than the opening up of the River Niger to trade. 50 years ago, there was not a single store shed north of the delta. Today, the banks of the main river and its branches, to a distance of 900 miles from the sea, are lined with British trading stations." The progress to be recorded since the above words were penned is astounding, and it undoubtedly surpasses every expectation of the pioneers of British interests in Nigeria. Since the assumption of the administration of the country by our government, January 1st, 1900, even greater progress can be recorded. The result is a complete upheaval of the political, economical, and social affairs of the country. Every native institution has been shaken in its foundations, and, at the present rate of progress, a great many of the most interesting facts concerning the primitive customs of the people will soon be matters of history and tradition only. Hence, this attempt to record some of these facts ere the period of transition be past, when the old shall have been overwhelmed by the new. The days of the palm oil ruffians are over. For years, the men who laid the foundations of the great commercial houses were with this sobriquet, and yet it is to their endurance and often daredevil pluck that we owe much of our present. In them we see repeated the instinct for adventure, the blood and bone, and the initiative of the Elizabethan mariners who started the Empire movement. Seldom now is the epithet applied to the coasters. On the other hand, the West African steamer, as she rests alongside Prince's Landing Stage, Liverpool, is still occasionally irreverently addressed as the monkey ship by that indescribable product, the quayside labourer, who earns a more or less precarious livelihood by handling passengers' baggage. From England to Sierra Leone, the voyage is similar to any ordinary journey by sea. From that point, there is a little more variation, chiefly arising from the fact that the transshipment of passengers and baggage is accomplished whilst the ship lies at anchor in the open roadsteads. The heavy rolling seas, as a rule, prohibit the use of companion ladders, and recourse must be had to derricks and mammy chairs. Native crews bring surf boats alongside, and into these the traveller and his goods are dumped. The operation is very unpleasant at any time, and when the sea is rough, it is decidedly uncomfortable. The native paddlers are very expert in handling their craft, and they need to be to avoid catastrophe. In the earlier days, European passengers climbed down the vessel's side by the rope ladder, or were hoisted over in a barrel adapted for the purpose by the removal of a quarter section to allow for easy entrance and exit. Nowadays, baskets or mammy chairs are used. Highly entertaining to the onlookers is the method of transshipping native passengers, of whom considerable crowds are carried between the coast ports. It had at least the merit of being very expeditious. A piece of stout canvas, some 12 feet square, was spread on the foredeck, and upon this were huddled 6 or 8 men. At once the 4 corners of the sail were gathered up and hitched to the derrick hook, and the bag of humanity was slung overboard without further ceremony. For a time it dangled at the end of the swaying rope, the poor imprisoned wretches being enveloped in darkness and, helpless to protect themselves as they were, bumped against the vessel's side. They remained suspended thus until the word was given to let go, when the bundle was dropped with a run into the bottom of the surfboat alongside. By that time, arms and legs had become almost inextricably mixed up, but the unravelling was a marvel of speedy ingenuity. 3 corners of the canvas were slipped off the hook, and then it was hauled up by the 4th corner, and the long-suffering beings shaken out and left to sort themselves at leisure. It was astonishing how quickly a number of natives could be transferred by this rough and ready method, and, except for an occasional ducking, accidents appear to have been rare events. Immense quantities of kola nuts, in charge of Mohammedan traders, are carried between the coast ports. They are bound up in huge round bundles containing some 3,000 to 4,000 nuts apiece, most carefully packed between fresh leaves and salt to prevent contact with the air. If exposed, they soon harden and lose their value. The bundles are very heavy and are carefully protected with stout coverings, the whole being enclosed in a network of strong cordage. Sometimes the foredeck is piled up with hundreds of bales of nuts, and they form one of the most valuable items of cargo. Passengers for the Niger proceed to the Forcados River and are there transferred to a launch or stern-wheel steamer, the latter being far preferable to the former. My first acquaintance with the Niger was whilst making the up-river passage in the old Rattler, a launch most appropriately named, some 30 feet in length by about 8 feet beam, driven by a small and noisy engine. In 1900, the number of passengers was so insignificant that the business of transport had scarcely been considered. The few who did travel upriver were granted passages more or less as acts of courtesy, upon payment of a sum rather substantial in proportion to the facilities conferred. In the case of the Rattler, judging by appearances, most of the woodwork originally supplied for cabin fittings and other purposes had been appropriated by the enterprising engineer for firewood. The native has no compunction whatever in using the first thing that serves his end, and one has seen a neighbour's roof stripped of all the thatch within reach of the hand, it having been commandeered in order to start the kitchen fire. On the occasion of my first passage, the Niger was in full flood. At such a time, it becomes an immense and imposing volume of water, or, more correctly, a saturated solution of mud. Navigation during the time of full river, that is, whilst heavy rains are falling, still has its discomforts, but that season is more expeditious than the dry for travelling, inasmuch that when the water is low, it frequently becomes a wearisome task to proceed either up or downstream. When 9 days are occupied by a good steamer in traversing 80 miles, travelling is apt to become tedious. It may be restful, but is not very entertaining, although unexpected adventures occasionally enliven the proceedings. To the newcomer there is much that is novel, and he, moreover, early discovers his own shortcomings and suffers from his lack of experience in the management of affairs. We had not proceeded many miles in the Rattler when we became aware of the fact that no cooking utensils were on board, and we were forced to accept the loan of a small begrimed pot, the property of one of the native crew. This had to serve as teapot, and to cook, in turn, every course comprising our menu. There was no hardship in this until the other purposes for which it was used became known to us. It was not appetizing to discover that the same little pot was used for stewing palm oil chop, some of the ingredients of which were questionable, and later that it served as the wash-up basin for plates and dishes, and finally for some of the boys themselves. In order to avoid the powerful current, small launches, when upstream, keep well in under the banks for the sake of the shelter afforded. But as the river is studded with islands and deviates in its course, this entails frequent crossings from one side to the other. There is a certain amount of compensation in this, inasmuch as it permits close observation of the country through which one is travelling. In the delta districts, the route is through a seemingly interminable mangrove swamp. In every direction, nothing meets the eye but water and dense banks of vegetation. In the dry season, hundreds of high and dry sandbanks add another colour to the picture. On the skyline, there is one dead level of treetops, a prospect which is extremely monotonous. Much credit is due to those Englishmen who endure life in these watery wastes, some in the interests of commerce, others in the administration of political affairs. How little the dividend-drawing public know of the dreary circumstances in which the toilers in these depressing regions live. The traveller finds a subject of fascinating interest in watching the native pilot as he threads his course through an amazing labyrinth of waterways. In the delta, channels open out in all directions, but the pilot is never in doubt. He presses steadily onward, not only by day, but often far into the night. On the lower reaches of the Niger, no villages are visible from the steamer, and the only indications of human life are the men and women paddling their dugouts under the shelter of the banks. These inhabitants of the swamps are scantily clothed, and their huge umbrella hats of plaited palm leaves give them a quaint appearance. The villages are hidden in the back bush wherever an acre or two of less swampy land affords an anchorage for a tiny cluster of huts. Little lanes of water, often invisible to the unobservant eye, connect the villages with the main stream. Sometimes the entrance is indicated by a juju house or a primitive flagstaff from which a fragment of white cloth flutters. The latter has also a religious significance that is not original, the custom being an innovation adopted in recent years by certain of the Delta tribes. As we proceed upriver, the swamp gives place to higher ground, and the banks become defined. Clearings in the forest are to be seen where plantains and bananas thrive. The increasing number and size of the villages, now built directly on the riverbanks, point to the fact that the country is well populated. One is struck with the lack of forethought exhibited by the natives when building these riverside villages. They are situated close to the water's edge, and, consequently, many huts are swept away during the annual flood. The swollen river, swirling along at a great pace, undermines the bank, causing large sections to fall into the water, carrying away at the same time huts and trees. The lesson of the year's disaster leaves no impression, and the native continues to build on precarious sites, as near the river as he can, presumably in order to be near his canoe, the river being the great, and often the only, highway to the markets. The huts are small and oblong in shape, the poorest in style and material in the whole country. They are constructed of mud and wattle and thatched with palm leaves. Sometimes they are built on the ground, in other cases they are raised on piles to protect them from the flood. The local clay is of inferior quality, with poor building properties, and is unsuitable for building substantial walls similar to those erected by the people in the districts higher up the river. The most important piece of property to the Delta native, as indeed to all natives dwelling in close proximity to the river, is the dugout canoe. It is indispensable, providing, as it does, the only means of intercourse with the outside world. In the wet season, no other mode of travelling is possible, and at times the native would be confined to the four walls of his hut were he deprived of his canoe. For the fashioning of a dugout, a tree is selected, by preference a mahogany for cheap canoes, bamboo or silk cotton trees are suitable, as near the water's edge as possible. From the main stem, a log of the length required is taken, and this is roughly hewn to shape and hollowed out with native axes. The axe work being completed, slow fire is applied to the hull, inside and out, and the rough parts made smooth. The canoes are of all dimensions, from those designed for a single paddler to those capable of carrying a dozen or more, with passengers and merchandise in addition. They are heavier and more cumbersome even than they look, and from personal experience, I can affirm that they do not compare favourably with a rowing skiff. Near Abo, the waters of the delta converge into one main stream, and the river assumes an aspect worthy of its title, the lordly Niger. At the close of the wet season, it is truly a mighty mass of water. Immediately the rains cease, however, it subsides at a remarkably rapid rate, and very soon sandbanks appear, and navigation becomes an intricate business. As far as Abo, the inhabitants of the districts traversed consist chiefly of the Jekri and Ijaw tribes, but from this point the Ibo people predominate. The scenery has changed also. No more mangrove swamp is met with, and the country is higher altogether, though still continuing uniformly and monotonously flat. Magnificent trees lift their heads above the dense undergrowth, those particularly noticeable being the bombax, silk cotton, uroko, commonly called African oak, mahogany, coconut, and oil palms. Viewed from the launch, the country is extremely picturesque and often beautiful, but at close quarters its attractiveness quickly diminishes. The luxuriant living foliage springs forth from a tangled mass of dead and decaying vegetation, rank and reeking in the humid atmosphere, the home of myriads of creatures that creep and crawl. The bush, as it is familiarly termed, is not the place to select for comfort and enjoyment. A day's run north from Abo brings the traveller to Onitsha, in the neighbourhood of which are seen the first signs of hilly country, a welcome relief from the depressing low levels hitherto encountered. Here it was that the present writer landed in 1900. The Rattler dropped her anchor just before midnight. The darkness was intense, and the pitch-black cloud banks of an approaching tornado provided an appropriate setting for his introduction to darkest Africa. Chapter 2. The Ibo Country. In 1900, Onitsha had not aspired to anything approaching its present importance, and it retained much of its primitive simplicity. The commercial centre of the district was at Abuchi, 2 or 3 miles downstream, and the administrative quarters, first of the Royal Niger Company and later of the government, were at Asapa, on the western side of the river. To the north of the town, following the left bank of the Nkisi stream, on the site now covered with government buildings, a large coffee plantation was laid out. Of the surrounding country, even of that comparatively near the settlement, but little was known. The existing maps were useless, as none contained reliable data, the names inserted being based upon reports and conjectures. Some names were curious, for example, Akpam and Nri. The latter certainly is a name well known over a considerable portion of the Ibo Country. It is the name of a small town which is the headquarters of a priestly cult, whose special functions are connected with the coronation of kings. Hence, Nri men, priests, being travellers, were met with frequently. When asked whence they came, the answer was a wave of the hand towards the east, and thus the name was given, in mistake, to the whole country lying east of Onitsha. It is only during the last few years, that is, since the British government assumed the administration, that appreciable progress has been made in opening up the interior districts. At the time of my landing at Onitsha, there was an attractive field for investigation in which the native could be studied in his primitive environment. The subsequent years have been equally interesting, but from another standpoint, viz., that of a spectator watching a nation passing through a period of transition. The process still continues, and the people and the country are changing at an extraordinarily rapid rate. The old conditions and landmarks are disappearing, and modern developments will soon obliterate all signs of ancient history. The limits of the Ibo Country have now been approximately defined, and the territory apportioned into districts. A network of government stations has been established, and trading and missionary interests show evidence of vigorous prosperity. The Ibos are distributed over the greater part of the central province of the Protectorate, and number about 4 millions, that is, probably half the total population of southern Nigeria. In the Delta districts, and especially in the neighbourhood of Bonny and other coast towns, they are not indigenous. They consist chiefly of slaves under the control of heads of houses. These slaves often outnumber the original inhabitants, and their language is of such vitality that Bonny Igbo predominates over the other dialects of the district. From the coastline of the Bight of Benin, the Ibo Country skirts the Ibibio, Arochukwu, and Efik territories. After that, its eastern boundary is formed by the Cross River. On the southern and western sides, it stretches to the borders of the Ijaw, Jekri, and Ijebo, and other tribes, and then spreads across the Niger to the confines of Benin. After passing 60 degrees 31 minutes north latitude, it narrows in once more, and extends in wedge-like formation until its northernmost limits reach the boundary between southern and northern Nigeria, where the Akpotis and Munchis are the nearest neighbours. The area covered by the tribe being so extensive, it follows that there is wide divergence in the physical features of the country. In the delta regions, the land is very low-lying. It is intersected by innumerable creeks, and for a considerable portion of the year becomes a typical tropic swamp. The vegetation is rank, and the atmosphere humid and enervating. Clothes, if left exposed to the night air, even inside the houses, are quite damp by morning. Rain falls in great quantities. As the sun sinks on a fine day, banks of white mist roll up, enveloping everything in their damp and chilly folds. In the neighbourhood of Onitsha, the prospect is more pleasing. For the traveller striking inland in an easterly direction, the scenery improves almost immediately, and charming hills and valleys out on all sides. The vegetation consists chiefly of scrub and jungle grass, with big patches of moorland here and there. Extensive and picturesque clumps of trees are scattered about, indicating, as a rule, the presence of towns and villages, or marking the sizes of burial grounds. On these higher levels, high only as compared with the delta, the soil is reddish and sandy, and, except in certain hilly spots, singularly stoneless. One has often seen holes opened out to a considerable depth without a solitary pebble being unearthed. However deep one penetrates, the soil retains its colour, and the only difference is the presence of more or less clay. It is of poor quality for agricultural purposes, and much labour is involved for which there is frequently no adequate return. The giant elephant grass, the shorter jungle grass, and a variety called atta or spear grass flourish. This last is very exasperating to farmers and to anyone else desirous of cleaning the ground, because every particle of root is capable of vigorous propagation. On the western side of the Niger, the aspect is totally different. A large part of the country is covered with forest. It is on a lower level than the eastern side and is much more fertile. Great quantities of yams and other crops are raised, and labor is richly rewarded. To provide sites for villages and land for agricultural purposes, clearings are made in the forest, and this has led to ruthless and wholesale destruction of valuable timber. The creation of a forestry department by the government will, no doubt, do much to remedy this evil. In proportion to what might be expected, flowers are scarce. The most beautiful are the many varieties of lilies and orchids. Palms predominate amongst the trees, the oil palm, Elaeis guineensis, being of the greatest value. It flourishes in a greater or less degree, according to situation, throughout the Ibo Country. The Raphia vinifera and other varieties furnish the natives with copious supplies of palm wine. The coconut also abounds, together with many other species of palm. The uses to which the palm trees and their products are put by the natives are unlimited, every part being utilized in one form or another. Compared with other parts of Africa, game is exceptionally scarce. Guinea fowl and partridges are few and wild. Buck of different varieties are to be secured occasionally, as also buffalo. In some of the rivers and creeks, the manatee flourishes. Hippopotami and crocodiles are common, though of late years they have exhibited a tendency to abandon the main river, owing to the disturbance occasioned by the ever-increasing steamer traffic. Leopards are sometimes troublesome, and there are several smaller species of the cat family. In bygone days there was a thriving market for ivory, a fact clearly attested by the arm and leg ornaments worn by men and women, and the magnificent horns carried by chiefs as part of their insignia of office. Nowadays, elephants are almost extinct in the Ibo Country, and ivory is a very expensive luxury. This scarcity of game is due, no doubt, to the fact that for generations every man was equipped with a gun, from the old flintlock pattern to the more modern Snider, and, until quite recently, there was no lack of ammunition. The practice has been to kill bird and beast without respect to age, sex, or season. The people being well distributed, the result of this indiscriminate slaughter has been to denude the country of game. The hippopotami and the crocodiles fared better, partly owing to the greater difficulties attendant upon hunting by water, but more particularly the guns and ammunition were not of sufficient power to bring about any appreciable reduction in their numbers. In appearance, the people exhibit wide divergences, due largely to local conditions. In the eastern districts, they are inclined to be thin and scraggy. This may arise from a combination of causes. In the first place, the cultivation of the land demands labor of a flesh-reducing character. Secondly, the yam crop is comparatively poor and meager, and supplies must be eked out with cassava, beans, maize, and other catch crops. The appearance of a crowd of carriers with their spare frames, spindle legs, and cucumber calves often prompts the thought that the men must have recently experienced a period of famine. On the western side, this is not the case. There the people are shorter and are of a stocky, thick-set build. They are disposed to be lazy, yet they are passionate, and of a rash and fiery temperament, the result probably of an overabundant supply of rich food. Color variations are prevalent from light olive to deepest black, and albinos are common. These freaks of nature are of unprepossessing appearance. They are not, however, treated as monstrosities. Indeed, the mother of an albino is usually gratified with her offspring. They are termed by the people Indi Aucha, that is, white people. Skin disfigurements are very common, especially amongst the elder folk. These produce a piebald condition, the hands and feet being the parts chiefly affected. This is, I suppose, due to some form of disease which destroys the underlying pigment. I personally have seen but one certain case, and one other so reputed, of a child born with white patches on the skin. The Ibo Country lies within the recognized Negro belt, and the people bear the main characteristics of that stock. Bridgeless and wide-open nostrils are striking features, likewise the thick protruding lips and the powerful jaws. The shape of the skull repeats itself with astonishing regularity, this peculiarity perhaps being accounted for by the process of moulding the shape of the head during infancy. There are certain customs which rather point to Levitic influence at a more or less remote period. This is suggested in the underlying ideas concerning sacrifice and in the practice of circumcision. The language also bears several interesting parallels with the Hebrew idiom. On the left bank of the Niger, society is chiefly based on patriarchal lines. Every town, and incidentally every family or household, stands by itself. There is no combination between town and town. Although the same language, and in times of peace, intermarrying with one another, the nearest neighbors are still regarded as strangers. For example, the people of Onitsha and those of Opusi do not reckon themselves as of one tribe, though a distance of less than 5 miles separates the two towns. With the exception of the king of Onitsha, there are no kings in these parts. The solitary instance, tradition states, owes its origin to Benin. It is alleged that the kings of Onitsha were subject to the king of Benin, and that recent holders of the title have been of Bini royal stock. On the opposite side of the river, native rule was maintained by kingly authority. It can be generally accepted, though not without reservations, that under native law, land cannot be alienated from the family, the head acting as trustee of the property. Permission is freely given to others to cultivate land, or even to build upon it, but the head and his successors can always claim its restoration at will. The claim imposed is merely one of proprietary rights. The occupier is seldom disturbed so long as he is prepared to acknowledge the ground landlord. Rent is not usually demanded, the tenancy being confirmed by the offering and acceptance of oji, a small gift such as a fowl, at the time permission to occupy the land is granted, and on more or less regular occasions subsequently. Amongst the people themselves, land is sometimes sold, and in thickly populated centres, parcels of land are owned outright by private individuals, in contradistinction to the more widely prevailing law which stipulates that all land is the property not of private persons, but of the community. Even in the latter case, however, land is appropriated definitely for the use of recognized holders. Personal property, including the wives and slaves, descends to the eldest son as heir, or, failing a son, to the eldest brother or male relative. A wife ordinarily has no rights, either over herself or her possessions, not excluding her children. She is part and parcel of her husband's property. As a rule, when left to their own resources, the Ibos are a sober race. They manufacture no intoxicating liquor. The nearest approach is palm wine, which is allowed to ferment by natural processes. Palm wine is frequently heavily adulterated with water. When fermentation has reached a certain stage, the wine is too much like vinegar to be enjoyable. Even the old takers make wry faces when drinking it. It is almost a physical impossibility to get drunk on fresh palm wine. Men certainly drink themselves into a fuddled state, but this is probably as much due to the enormous quantities at a carousal as to the amount of alcohol taken. To consume a similar quantity of tea would produce more serious consequences. No method of distilling is practiced. The Ibos have no knowledge whatever of this process. Drunkenness, unfortunately, is on the increase, brought about entirely by the importation of foreign spirits. But for this traffic, the Ibos would be second to none for sobriety. The opening up of interior districts affords opportunities for the expansion of the traffic, and the square green bottles are in evidence at all the markets. The introduction of spirituous liquors is a distinctly foreign feature. In many places it has already destroyed some quaint old customs. To be offered whiskey or German beer when paying a call a native chief is an innovation greatly to be deplored, especially when compared with the old ceremony of sealing friendships by sharing the kola nut. All the sentiment has departed, and, with it, the touch of reality that graced the ancient institution. This is denationalization in one of its most pernicious forms. Where water is plentiful, the people are of cleanly habits, the women more so than the men. It is the women's business to fetch the household supply of water, and the visit to the stream provides an opportunity to bathe. The men are usually satisfied with a moderate amount of ablutionary effort, proportional to the supply of water at their disposal. The number of those who will exert themselves sufficiently to go to the stream solely for bathing is not large. Of sanitary ideas there is none, nor is there any sense of modesty as the European understands the term. As regards sanitation, however, it must be remembered that the sun is a powerful purifying agent. Otherwise, the conditions would, in many places, be unendurable. The word morality has no significance in the Igbo vocabulary. On the other hand, where the natives have remained untouched by outside influence, there is nothing exactly corresponding to the social evil of European life. The Ibos, as might be expected, are not patterns of morality, but in their primitive state they are at least free from artificial vice and its attendant evils. In the majority of Ibo towns, a very clearly defined code of morals exist theoretically. Infringements of these laws may lead to severe penalties being inflicted, and cases are not unknown where infidelity on the part of a wife has been punished by the torture and death of both offenders. Extreme measures, however, were resorted to only when the aggrieved husband proved inexorable and rejected every offer of reparation. Instead of capital punishment, the guilty wife was usually banished, and her accomplice condemned to pay a fine which, in some instances, meant his being financially crippled for life. The weather conditions of the Ibo country are very similar to those of the West Coast generally. They possess the merit, at least, of being regular. The dry season begins early in November, the rains concluding with a few heavy showers. Towards the end of December or in early January, some slight rain will fall, ushering in the harmattan. This is a period of excessive dryness. A dull haze caused by minute particles of dust obscures the sun. The dry heat sets up irritation of the skin and nostrils, and sometimes causes the lips to crack. During the day it is very hot, and this great heat is succeeded at night by a very low temperature. Europeans find the weather distinctly chilly at night, and it is much too cold for the comfort of the natives. These conditions last from 2 to 5 weeks. The harmattan is succeeded by the hot season proper, and the heat grows more and more oppressive until the end of March. The breaking up of the dry season is heralded by terrific tornadoes, wind, rain, thunder and lightning all being of extremely violent character. May and June are sometimes termed the little dries. That is, the weather is mostly fine, with heavy downpours of rain at intervals. At the beginning of July, the wet season starts in earnest. A huge rainfall is registered between the beginning of July and the middle of October, from which date the rains gradually slacken, and the wet season ends as it began, with a series of tornadoes. These being much less severe than those which prevail at the breakup of the hot season. As regards climate, the Ibo Country shares the unenviable reputation of the west coast of Africa. In the past, it has maintained its evil reputation and fully justified its claim to rank as part of the white man's grave. Under modern conditions, health statistics among Europeans have improved wonderfully. The great increase in the number of doctors, the judicious use of quinine as part of the daily rations, the wider knowledge of hygiene, and the short service system have all conduced to a more satisfactory state of affairs. The climate itself is pleasant, or the reverse, according to a man's own temperament. One prefers the wet season, another the dry. Both have their merits. The former is cooler, but the conditions for travelling are frequently abominable. Rain falls in torrents, roads and tracks are converted into sluices, and one lives in a state of perpetual dampness. Outside, the rain beats down mercilessly. Indoors, one must search for a sheltered spot, for few native roofs can resist the downpours. To retire to bed protected by a mackintosh and a bath towel, and even by an umbrella, as one has had to do on occasions, is very amusing in the retrospect, but very uncomfortable in actual experience. There is nothing more irritating and no more effectual preventive to sleep than the drip, drip, drip of water upon one's face or body. In the dry season, one is free from these discomforts, and camp can be made safely anywhere. But the sun and heat are liable to tax some constitutions rather severely. The spell of the coast, whether it be exercised by the country, the climate, or the people, is apt to weave itself closely into the life of the average European. Whilst in the west coast he roundly abuses country and climate, he is never amiss in his calculations concerning the date of his furlough. When on leave, immediately the novelty of the homecoming has worn off, his mind involuntarily wanders coastwards once more. It is the West Coast feeling, whatever be the causes which produce it. There are, of course, unpleasant conditions to be endured by the resident in Nigeria, but only two that need be mentioned, viz. The violent tornadoes which sweep across the country with such destructive force, and, greatest of all nuisances, the insect pest. Mosquitoes, sandflies, driver and white ants are positive plagues. In addition, there are innumerable varieties of other insects which are increasingly active in their venomous attacks on man and beast. These minor trials and afflictions, however, are not sufficient to counteract the fascination that draws the European so persistently back to the Ibo Country. Chapter 3. The Ibo Country, continued. For many years, intercourse with the Ibos was limited to those dwelling in the neighbourhood of the factories scattered here and there on the riverbanks. The traders had no special interest or inducement to penetrate into the interior, for trade filtered through to them and the river afforded every facility for transport. They had simply to select suitable centres and there barter for the produce brought in by land and water. Missionaries itinerated in various directions, but with no striking results. Eventually, the lines of advance shaped themselves directly east and south of Onitsha on the one side and west of Asaba on the other. There was no lack of reports from the interior. In the eastern hinterland, the raiding expeditions of the Ibans were a fruitful source of fear, and the havoc wrought by the Ekwemeku on the western side provided a topic for endless discussion in the streets and markets. Nor were these fears groundless. Cannibalism, human sacrifices, and other savage customs were real facts and flourished within 5 miles of the outskirts of Onitsha, and no one would dare swear that the inhabitants of even that town were all entirely innocent. It is well within living memory that human sacrifices were offered, the death and burial of a king or notable chief being the most usual occasions. At one period, I was living in a tiny hut set up in the bush some 5 miles east of Onitsha, surrounded by a number of towns. Between 2 of these, there was a feud of long standing. At intervals, war broke out in earnest. During the last campaign, one party captured and afterwards ate 7 of their opponents, whilst the other party secured only 4 victims. Regularly, I visited the village of the attacked tribe and was given a quiet, if not enthusiastic, reception. The chief, in whose house I would sit down, used to listen quite placidly to the conversation. He would recline upon the goat skin thrown on the floor, or, quite frequently, he would use the occasion to grind up snuff. Leaves of tobacco were parched in a potsherd, and then ground with a small wooden pestle in a crude mortar. After an hour's discussion, the chief invariably brought the interview to an end by declaring that he and his people would be quite ready to take heed to the words spoken, on the one condition that I would first of all assist them. It was always the same request. The enemy had secured 3 more men than his people had captured. If I would guarantee to arrange for 3 men to be handed over to balance matters, then they would be able to attend to other things. I might add that the account has never been settled to their satisfaction. At that time, I was accustomed to wander freely from village to village, very often unaccompanied. One morning I was walking alone when I came upon a bundle of sticks lying in the path. To this was attached a clean and fresh human skull, which I judged from the teeth and size to be that of a young man. It had been utilized as a fetish. It would act as a solemn warning to would-be thieves, and such a powerful juju would ensure the owner finding his property intact, however long it was left on the road. It was in close proximity to this place that, as was well known, a cannibal feast had lately been held. Amongst our lads there was a small boy whose father had been a servant to the Niger Company. Whilst carrying a message to Abushi, the father was murdered and his body disposed of according to time-honoured custom. On one occasion, I was resting outside my hut when a man of unprepossessing appearance came along and entered into conversation. His eldest son, then a small lad, had been placed by his father in the care of a missionary, in order that he might receive instruction. In the course of his remarks, he solemnly asserted that it would be of great benefit to his son if he were provided with human flesh sometimes as part of his diet. He maintained that, if this were done, a proper man's spirit would develop in the lad. The Royal Niger Company concluded many treaties with native chiefs and kings during their period of administration of the country. By these treaties, certain rights were conceded to the company, and they, in return, granted, among other considerations, a promise of protection. The people of Okuzu had ever been a truculent crowd, and raided not only on their own account but went further and procured bands of Abams to assist them in their predatory excursions. An appeal to the company for protection was made by a town in the neighbourhood, and in due course troops were dispatched to cool the ardour of the disturbers of the peace. The majority of the carriers employed for the soldiers were Onitsha men, and this is the story related concerning some of them. After some preliminary fighting, the troops entered Okuzu and settled into camp. When all was apparently quiet, a party of carriers considered the time was opportune for them to secure their share of the loot, and they went away bent on plunder. But the Okuzus were wily men. They had anticipated the move and had planned a deliberate trap for possible looters. Some goats were placed in one of the compounds, and the Okuzus secreted themselves in the neighbourhood. Presently, the gang of carriers arrived, attracted by the goats, and they walked right into the ambush. Some fought their way back to camp, but 17 were left dead or alive in the hands of the Okuzu braves. The story is that of these, the dead were eaten first, and later the wounded followed the fate of their comrades. Those who were uninjured were trussed up like fowls, and in this way kept until required. Towards the south, cannibal tendencies assumed a worse aspect. All that has been said hitherto relates to the prevalent custom of feasting upon captives taken in war. In the southern districts, a regular traffic in human flesh was carried on. Strangers were caught, or slaves purchased, with the deliberate intention of converting them into food. Human flesh was a marketable commodity and a common article of diet. It is not long since a certain chief managed to get possession of one of his opponents, against whom he had a grudge of long standing. He derived satisfaction from first lopping off the captive's ears and nose, and then flaying him alive. The carcass was eaten, and the skin converted into a drumhead. There is not a shadow of doubt that, could the history of the Ibo country be clearly traced, a host of such-like stories would have to be recorded. I have become acquainted with many erstwhile cannibals, and quite good-natured folk most of them are. One weekend I was staying at a town a few miles southeast of Onitsha. My quarters were very circumscribed, the only accommodation available being a tiny thatched lean-to shed against the compound wall, usually occupied by the goats and fowls. My boys and carriers shared the limited accommodation, lying at night alongside the camp bed. After the evening meal, we settled down for the night, long before our customary bedtime. Consequently, the men chattered freely. Presently, I became interested in the conversation, and amongst other items of news, gathered that they had all had a share in cannibal feasts. At first they were reticent, but gradually they out and announced what they considered to be the choicest titbits. These, they affirmed, were the knuckles. They were strapping young fellows whom I had got to know sufficiently well to induce them to travel round with me. Since then they have all become Christians, and one is a very successful and much respected evangelist. In the late autumn of 1900, an opportunity presented itself for extending our knowledge of the country lying west of Asaba. Our party consisted of volunteers from amongst the native adherents, and we proceeded through the country as far as a large town called Abwar. At the time, the king still regarded himself as tributary to His Majesty of Benin, in spite of the fact that there was then no king reigning there. and was acknowledged as second in prestige throughout the district. The first evening that I walked about Abwar, I found a shrine with a human skull upon the altar, and I ascertained that the same views were held as regards human sacrifice that were held in Benin prior to the expedition of 1897. In 1904 came the rising of the Ekwemeku, commonly but probably incorrectly described as the Silent Ones. An immense amount of damage was done before the insurrection was quelled, whilst not long after, the massacre of one of the district commissioners with his escort ushered in a further period of trouble for the government. In such circumstances, the carrier problem was a difficult one. Owing to the unsettled state of the country, it was not easy to persuade men to accompany one on journeys that took them far from their homes. Even when one got a following, it was quite uncertain whether the men would stick to their task or desert, and one might find himself in an awkward and irritating predicament. On a certain occasion, a compact was made between myself and another missionary. We arranged to leave our respective quarters on the same day, and for our routes to cut one another at a fixed point. My companions would then join his party, and the canoemen who had brought him up the creek were to convey me down to Onitsha. The distance was not great, and soon after 2 p.m., after some 8 hours on the road, I arrived at the appointed spot on the bank of the creek. My colleague was to land a few miles further up, and as they returned downstream, the canoemen were to look out for me. A couple of miles before we reached the creek, my companions, with the exception of one lad, struck northwards in order to intercept the other party. On arrival at the water's edge, we looked for the canoe, but our expectations ended in complete disappointment, for it never appeared. I had no kit with me, our food was exhausted, and altogether the situation was rather humiliating. Hour after hour went by, and the sun went down. Finally, we came across an old fisherman, who, seeing we were completely at his mercy, agreed to paddle us down river, at his own price. He conducted us to his primitive landing stage, but no canoe was visible. In reply to our inquiry as to the whereabouts of his craft, he merely gave a curt nod in the direction of the water. He then waded out up to his middle, dived down, and fished up his little dugout from the bottom. It was badly battered, and before embarking, the man had to plug several holes with clay. As the canoe was only intended for one, the added weight of 2 passengers was almost too much for it. It was a ticklish business getting aboard, and even more difficult to make headway. The ordinary canoeman never sits on the floor, but on the gunwale or the small flat stern piece. From start to finish, my business was to bail out, for, being so laden, we shipped water at every stroke of the paddle. Darkness soon fell, and almost immediately we struck a submerged tree, and were only saved from disaster by the smart movements of our navigator. To illustrate the skill of these canoemen, it may be mentioned that when it became dark, our man, a tall and heavily built individual, carefully raised himself, stood up in the stern, and balanced himself with a foot on either side of the canoe. In this position, he paddled with long, sweeping strokes. He maintained this attitude for some 4 hours, only resting once when we were forced to run to the bank for shelter whilst a powerful breeze was blowing. When a strong wind blows, especially upstream, the waters of the Niger are rough and dangerous for small craft. On arrival at my destination, I ascertained that my colleague had fulfilled his part of the program and had proceeded up the creek. Soon after landing, however, panic seized the men because they thought they were expected to act as carriers for the land journey. Hence, after depositing the loads, a rush was made for the canoe. They cast off from the bank and never rested until they were home again. My colleague fared worse than I did, inasmuch as the influence of the first deserters led to most of the remaining followers also leaving him, and he did not come in until a week later, all his plans having been frustrated, to say nothing of his having spent an uncomfortable time adrift in the bush. The plan I usually adopted, and do still when travelling in the Ibo Country, is a simple one. If but a short visit to a strange town was intended, I went accompanied by not more than 2 natives, one of whom would have some knowledge of English and be capable of rendering assistance should any language difficulties arise. For a more prolonged stay, 3 carriers were added to the party, and we were seldom more than half a dozen in number. Such a small company aroused no suspicion, more especially because it was obvious to the inhabitants that we carried no firearms. Our numbers might have been reduced yet further, but there are no beasts of burden in the country, and therefore all loads have to be carried by men. Unless a direct invitation had been received from someone else, I made a point of going straight to the house of the paramount chief and of putting myself under his protection. This plan was invariably successful. Having explained the reasons for our visit and allayed any suspicions he may have entertained, we were able to converse on easy terms. Immediately this stage was reached, the chief would indicate that kola nut should be brought, and once this was shared, we were quickly on friendly terms. The Ibo is very hospitable, and many of the chiefs are nature's gentlemen. Sometimes it came to our knowledge that we had ventured into what might have been awkward situations, but personally I noted suspicious features on but the rarest occasions. Being naturally of a highly nervous disposition, my mind was often assailed by imaginary troubles prior to starting on tour, but having begun the journey, these were quickly forgotten in the keen interest of the expedition. As all travelling had to be done on foot, by the time our destination was reached, I was too fatigued to think of anything but food and rest. The depressing times, as already stated, were when we journeyed through a downpour of rain and crept into camp miserable and chilly, with all our belongings soaked with water. Cheerfulness is a special grace in these circumstances. Matters improve, however, after a rest and food, and it is not long before the discomforts of the way are forgotten. Contrary to the general rule of making a very early start, I prefer waiting until after breakfast, and frequently choose the afternoon hours for travelling. During my early days, it was the custom to rise at an unearthly hour, strike camp whilst it was still dark, and get off as dawn appeared. This meant disturbed and curtailed rest, being nipped by voraciously hungry mosquitoes which had hunted all night for their prey, and bad tempers all round. It was too early to eat anything substantial, and yet one knew that not to do so meant reaching famishing point before the next meal was forthcoming. The mornings may be either chilly or oppressive, and everything is drenched with dew. Often and often one has been wet through to the skin within 10 minutes of starting, and cold dew is distinctly uncomfortable. It also meant marching in wet clothes until the sun was well up to dry them. It occurred to me that this was anything but a healthy practice, and hence I tried starting at later hours. I now infinitely prefer setting forth at a reasonable hour of the day, after one has been able to partake of a substantial meal with some measure of comfort. The heat and glare are sometimes trying, but these drawbacks are more easily endured than the depressed and sinking feeling necessitated by early starts. Travelling in this simple manner, I was never once molested, and have never had cause to grumble at the treatment meted out to me at any of the places visited, however evil the reputations they may have borne.